I am Mike D, and this is the history of money, banking, and trade. Here's what I want you to think about. Every financial system you interact with today, every bank, every currency, every credit agreement, is the product of 1,000 years of human ingenuity, necessity, and occasionally spectacular failure. This podcast is a story of how it all began, evolved, and became the world we live in. We're starting in the ancient world, and we're not stopping until we reach the present. Welcome aboard. Today, we're covering one of the most consequential 112-year stretches in financial history, from the death of Nero in 68 CE to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE. This is the heart of Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And by the end of the episode, you're going to see the Roman Empire at its absolute economic peak. And you're also going to see, hiding in plain sight, every crack that would eventually bring the whole structure down. We've got emperors buying and selling the throne like a distressed asset. We've got a tax on urine that spawned a phrase bankers still use 2,000 years later. We've got the world's first shopping mall, papyrus that reads like a modern letter of credit, a plague that gutted the workforce, and an emperor who held a 2-month yard sale of the palace treasure rather than raise taxes. And this time, at every stop, we're going to do what this show does best: hold the ancient story up against the modern one. Because just as the financial crisis of 33 rhymed with 2008, if you've heard that episode, you know exactly what I mean. This century of Roman history rhymes with resource booms, trade deficit panics, pandemic economics, debt forgiveness fights, and central bank credibility battles that you have personally lived through. But first, we have to get through the year 69 CE, the year Rome learned exactly what the imperial throne cost, literally in cash. When Nero died in June of 68 CE, he was abandoned, declared an enemy of the state, driving a dagger into his own throat with the help of his secretary. He left behind 2 things: an empty treasury and no heir. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family line of Augustus that had ruled Rome for a century, was extinct. And for the first time, Rome discovered what the historian Tacitus called the secret of empire. Emperors could be made somewhere other than Rome, by armies, for money. What followed was the year of 4 emperors, and I want you to watch what happens through the financial lens, because every single one of these men rose and fell on a question of money. Emperor number 1, Servius Scupulus Galba. Well, Galba wasn't related to the Julio-Claudians at all. He was from an old, distinguished noble family, governor of the Spanish province in his early 70s, and famously, catastrophically, stingy. Here's the thing about becoming emperor in this era. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers stationed in Rome itself, expected a donation, a cash bonus. Think of it as a signing bonus for their loyalty, and by 68 CE, it was effectively the transaction fee on the imperial throne. Galba's agents had promised the guard a hefty donation in his name. When Galba arrived in Rome, he refused to pay it. His response became infamous: "I choose my soldiers. I do not buy them." It's a noble sentiment, but turns out to be terrible treasury management. Because here's the reality. Loyalty in post-Nero Rome was a market, whether Galba liked it or not, and he had just defaulted on the biggest IOU in the empire. On January 1st of 69 CE, the legions on the Rhine refused to swear loyalty to him, toppled his statues, and demanded a new emperor. The next day, the soldiers of Germania Inferior proclaimed their own governor, alias Vitellius, emperor. Galba scrambled. He had adopted a young nobleman, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinius, as his heir, hoping to project stability. But adoption doesn't pay soldiers. On January 15th, the Praetorians, the very men he had stiffed, cut Galba down in the middle of the forum. He lasted just 7 months. Emperor number 2, Marcus Otho. And who was behind the Praetorians' blades? Otho, a former drinking buddy of Nero's, who had done what Galba wouldn't. He promised to guard their money. Otho essentially purchased the throne in a leveraged buyout. And he immediately learned that it was much easier to overthrow an emperor than rule one. Reading through Galba's private correspondence, Otho discovered the size of the problem marching toward him. The legions of Germania had already declared for Vitellius and were advancing on Italy. The decisive clash came at the First Battle of Betriacum in northern Italy on April 14, 69 CE. Otto's forces were beaten decisively. The Praetorian Guard, the core of his strength, and the very soldiers he had bought broke and fled before even coming into close combat. Turns out, purchased loyalty has a short duration. And then Otho did something nobody expected. Rather than drag the empire through a civil war, he had reserves, he had legions still coming from the Danube, he chose to end it. On April 16th, one day after the battle, Otho stabbed himself with a dagger, reportedly saying he could die more honorably than he could reign. Tacitus tells us some of his soldiers were so moved that they killed themselves beside his funeral pyre. Few Romans could believe that a companion of Nero, a man who had bought his way to power, had chosen such an honorable exit, 3 months on the throne. Emperor number 3 was Aelius Vitellius. Vitellius took power in April and tried to build legitimacy the cheapest way available, through nostalgia. He publicly honored and imitated Nero, who, despite everything, remained generally popular with the common people of the empire. But Vitellius' real reputation was for spectacular consumption. Ancient sources, which were hostile ones to be fair, claim he burned through hundreds of millions of sesterces on banquets in a matter of months, including a legendary dish nicknamed the Shield of Minerva. Pike livers, pheasant brains, flamingo tongues, and lamprey innards with ingredients shipped in naval vessels from across the empire. Whether or not you believe every detail, the message the sources are sending is clear. This is a man consuming the empire, not governing it. Meanwhile, out east, the legions putting down the revolt in Judea had their own idea. In July of 69 CE, they proclaimed their commander a gruff, self-made general, Vespasian, emperor. Vespasian's forces crushed Vitellius' army at the Second Battle of Bedriacum. When it was clear his support was collapsing, Vitellius actually tried to abdicate, tried to negotiate his way out, but his own supporters wouldn't let him. The result was a brutal street battle for the city of Rome itself. On December 20th, 69 CE, Vitellius was dragged through the streets and executed by Vespasian's soldiers in 8 months. If you're adding all this up, that's 4 emperors in 18 months. And notice the pattern. The throne had become a financial instrument. It was bought with donations, defended with army payrolls, and lost when the money or credibility ran out. If this pattern feels familiar, it should. Political scientists who study coups today find that one of the strongest predictors is brutally simple: whether the soldiers have been paid. And the corporate world stages the same kind of drama every time control of a company comes into play. A contested succession becomes a bidding war for the loyalty of whoever actually operates the machinery. Run the year 69 CE through that lens. Galba defaulted on his obligations and was liquidated. Otho overpaid for an asset he couldn't operate. Vitellius burned through the working capital on consumption. And the eventual winner was the disciplined outside operator with the strongest cash flow, the Eastern legions, and control of Egypt's grain. The Year of Four Emperors is a hostile takeover battle fought with swords. Rome desperately needed an accountant-in-chief. It got one. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, also just known as Vespasian, ruled from 69 to 79 CE, and he is, for the money, pun fully intended by the way, the most underrated financial mind ever to wear the purple. And just a reminder, when I say purple, purple came from the Phoenicians, who had basically went out to the sea and mined the shellfish to use as a purple dye. The purple dye became so in demand in the ancient world that only the wealthy could afford to buy purple dye clothes. So purple dye basically became affiliated with royalty and wealth. So that's why the ancients often wore purple if they were the rulers, and you still see it today. You look at some of the kings and queens of the British Empire, for example, the queens often wore purple. So the idea of wearing the purple is an idea of royalty that literally goes back nearly 3,000 years, if not more. So getting back on track here, first we need to start where Vespasian came from because it matters. Vespasian did not come from the traditional senatorial elite. His grandfather had been a centurion and a debt collector. His father was a tax collector and a small-time moneylender in the provinces. This is remarkable. The man who would rescue Rome's finances grew up in the family business of collections and lending. His rise shows you something real about the Roman Empire in its era. Social mobility was increasing, and competence was starting to matter as much as bloodline. The Year of the Four Emperors killed the idea that you needed a Julio-Claudian ancestry to rule. Vespasian proved you could get there on ability, and of course on the loyalty of his legions. When Vespasian took power, he made a public assessment of the damage. According to the biographer Suetonius, he declared that the treasury needed 40 billion sesterces to be set right, a number so enormous that historians still argue about whether it's a manuscript error. But even if the real figure was 4 billion, the message was the same. Nero's lavish spending, the civil wars, and years of mismanagement had left Rome functionally insolvent. And unlike Galba, Vespasian understood that you couldn't moralize your way out of a fiscal hole. You had to collect. So here's what he actually did. And this is one of the most comprehensive fiscal reform programs in ancient history. For one, he raised, restored, and invented taxes. Vespasian reinstated taxes Galba had abolished, raised provincial tributes, in some cases doubling it, and creating new revenue streams. He revoked the tax immunity Nero had granted to Greece, putting the province back on the rolls. He ordered new provincial censuses to update the tax base because you can't tax what you haven't counted. This is a basic, unglamorous, spreadsheet-level governance, and is exactly what Rome needed. The second thing he did was he reclaimed public land. Across Italy and the provinces, private landlords had quietly absorbed slivers of unassigned public land for generations. Vespasian set out surveyors and demanded the state property back or repayment for it. Imagine a government running a full audit of its squatters' rights across an entire empire. It was wildly unpopular with landowners and wildly effective for the treasury. The third thing he did, probably one of the more famous ones, was the urine tax. I know that sounds very bizarre, but I'll get into that. So Vespasian taxed the collection of urine from Rome's public latrines. And before you laugh, because it does sound kind of weird, urine was a generally valuable industrial commodity. The ammonia in it was used by fullers to launder wool togas and by the tanners to process leather. Entire industries depended on it. So Vespasian did what he did best. He found an untaxed revenue stream and then taxed it. Now his son Titus was disgusted and complained that money was beneath the dignity of the empire. So Vespasian held a coin up to Titus's nose and asked if he smelled it. When Titus said no, Vespasian replied, "And yet it comes from urine." That story gave us the Latin proverb, pecunia non ole, money doesn't stink, a phrase that's still invoked in finance 20 centuries later. To this day, public urinals in France are called Vespasian, and in Italy, Vespasiani. There are worse ways to be remembered, and notice how modern the move itself is. Every government since has gone hunting for untaxed value streams exactly the way Vespasian did. Sin taxes on tobacco and sugar, congestion charges on city driving, digital service taxes on tech platforms, levies on hotel stays and airline seats. Whenever a legislature discovers a previously untaxed flow of economic activity and decides the treasury deserves a cut, that's the vectigo urine updated. Money still doesn't stink. The fourth thing he did was the Fiscus Judaicus. After the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Vespasian converted the annual half-shekel tax that Jews had paid to the temple in Jerusalem into a Roman tax. 2 denarii per year, paid by the Jews across the empire, into a new dedicated fund called the Fiscus Judaicus, which was used to rebuild the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline. Notice the fiscal machinery. Rome was creating dedicated, earmarked revenue funds from their own administration. That's the real innovation in public finance. And hold on to that thread, because this particular tax is going to come back in an ugly way under his son Domitian and get reformed under Nero. So the fifth thing he did was he spent the windfall visibly. The conquest of Judea produced a staggering one-time haul of plunder, the treasure of the temple, mass enslavements, and indemnities. This was Rome's economic model in miniature, and we'll come back to it. It was conquest as revenue. Vespasian poured that windfall into construction, most famously the Flavian Amphitheater. You know it as the Colosseum. We actually have the receipts on this. A reconstructed, dedicated inscription indicates that the amphitheater was built ex manibus, from the spoils of war. The Colosseum was a war dividend, paid out to the public in the form of entertainment, and a permanent billboard for Flavian generosity and power. And I have one more Vespasian story, because it tells you how he thought about labor and the economy. An engineer came to him with a labor-saving invention, a machine for hauling massive columns up the Capitol at low cost. Vespasian paid the man handsomely for the invention, and then declined to use it, saying, quote, "Allow me to feed my poor commons." He deliberately chose the more expensive, labor-intensive method because tens of thousands of Romans depended on construction wages. You can debate the economics. That's a fascinating argument about productivity versus employment that we will still have today. But it shows you an emperor thinking about the velocity of money through ordinary hands, not just the treasury balance. And recognize the argument because we're still having it. This is about the automation debate 2,000 years earlier. It's the Luddites smashing textile frames in 1811. It's the dock workers striking against the shipping container in the 1960s. It's every current argument about AI and the people whose work the machine can do cheaper. However, I will throw this caveat with the AI thing. I think with the AI debate, though, it is the same, but it's also different, because one of the issues that I think people are coming to realize with AI nowadays is that AI is a classic case of socializing the costs and privatizing the gains. So if you want to build all these AI data centers, people have realized that it might come for our jobs, it might not. We don't know how it's going to play out. It might be great, it might be bad. History shows us that whenever there's a major innovation, it turns out to be good in the long run. But one thing is clear is that when they build these new AI data centers, the average tax-paying person, whether you own a house or rent, your electricity and potential water usage bills are going to go up tremendously. So that's a big difference. We know that AI is going to obviously affect certain jobs and possibly my job in the future, who knows. But I think this time is a little different when it comes to the debate. I think most people might be okay with the fact that AI might be a great innovation and might be good for humanity in general, but I think most people don't want to pay for some millionaires and billionaires to make a boatload of money when they're the ones that are going to lose out. But that's just my 2 cents. I apologize for getting off topic. But either way, you can see that the debate of automation has been going on literally thousands of years now. So getting back on track, Vespasian's answer to pay for the invention, then shelve it to protect employment, is one government still quietly reach for every time they subsidize an industry that pure efficiency would kill. Vespasian kept his modest habits to the end. He joked constantly about his own humble origins, and even his death became a punchline. As he lay dying in 79 CE, he reportedly quipped, "Vai puto deus fio." Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god, mocking the Roman custom of deifying dead emperors. Then insisting that an emperor ought to die standing, he struggled to his feet and died in the arms of his attendants. So in 10 years, he took an insolvent, traumatized empire and handed his son a stable government, a replenished treasury, and for the first time in Roman history, a peaceful succession from father to natural son. The Flavian dynasty he founded would rule for 27 years. Political stability, it turns out, is a financial asset, maybe the most valuable one there is. Vespasian's elder son Titus reigned for just 2 years, from 79 to 81 CE, but what a 2 years. 2 months into his reign, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. The next year, a massive fire tore through Rome, followed by an outbreak of disease. Titus responded by opening the treasury, funding relief from the imperial money, even stripping decorations from his own palaces to help rebuild, and personally touring the disaster zones. He completed the Colosseum, opened it with 100 days of games. He was so committed to his image as a benefactor that, according to Suetonius, when he realized one evening at dinner that he had done no one a favor all day, he said, "Friends, I have lost a day." He died of fever in 81, and it was deeply mourned. But here's the thing about Vesuvius and why a volcanic catastrophe belongs in a podcast about money and banking. By burying the Bay of Naples in ash, Vesuvius accidentally preserved the single best archive of Roman banking records ever found. In 1959, construction workers near Pompeii at a place called Myrcine uncovered a cache of wooden wax tablets, the business records of the Sepuce, a family firm of financiers operating out of Puteoli, a great commercial port on the Bay of Naples where the Alexandrian grain fleet had docked. These tablets, dating from the decades right before the eruption, are astonishing. They contain loan agreements, deposit receipts, guarantees, auction records, and legal documents. And they show us a credit system far more sophisticated than most people imagine when they picture the ancient world. I went into this a little bit in the previous episode, but let me kind of go back in real quickly. And let me give you just one concrete example from the tablets. A merchant named Lucius Marius Lusundus borrows 10,000 sesterces, and as collateral, he pledges 13,000 modai of Alexandrian wheat sitting in a specific named warehouse in Puteoli. The warehouse receipt effectively functions as a security for a loan. That's commodity-backed lending against warehouse goods, a financing structure that would be instantly recognizable to a modern trade finance banker. We even see the rental of the warehouse space itself included as part of the deal. So if you heard our episode on the financial crisis of 33 CE, the one with the eerie parallels to 2008, you already know that Rome had learned the hard way what happens when credit is secured by collateral whose value everyone has quietly overestimated. The Sepuce tablets show us the same machine running in calm weather. A loan against grain in a warehouse works beautifully as long as the grain is real, the warehousemen are honest, and the price of the wheat holds. Modern banks do precisely this. It's called warehouse receipt financing, and it still blows up in precisely the ancient ways, usually when someone pledges the same collateral to two lenders at once. 2 centuries of progress, same fraud. So let's take a step back and talk about how Roman banking actually worked in this period, because Pax Romana was its golden age. At the street level, you have the numerarii, the money changers, and assayers. Rome was awash in coin from every era and in every corner of the Mediterranean, plus forgeries, plus clipped and worn pieces. The numerarii tested coins by weight, by sound, by touch, and they certified them and sealed verified batches into bags. They were the quality control layer of the monetary system, and over time, many moved up into deposit banking. Above them sat the argentarii, the true private bankers, and the argentarius offered a menu of services that would sound very familiar. Deposit accounts, both sealed deposits held for safekeeping and open deposits the banker could lend out, the ancestor of your checking account. Payments by book transfer. If you and your creditor both banked with argentarii, you could settle by debt by having the banker adjust the ledgers. No coins ever changed hands. Payment for mensum through the bank was a routine phrase. There was credit at auctions. This was a Roman specialty. Auctions were everywhere in Roman commercial life. There were estate auctions, slaves, goods, property, and the argentarii sat in the middle, advancing the purchase price to the seller immediately and collecting from the buyer later for a commission. They were market makers in the literal sense. They offered guarantees. Under an arrangement called the receipt of the argentarii, a banker could formally guarantee his client's debts to a third party. That's a banker's letter of guarantee 2,000 years before SWIFT. And what SWIFT means in modern banking is it stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Finance Telecommunications. And basically what that means in trade finance, it's a secure global messaging network that banks could use to transmit standardized trade instructions, such as letters of credit and payment guarantees. It doesn't move or hold actual funds, but it does act as a core communication backbone connecting over 11,000 institutions across over 200 countries. So what Rome is doing is offering money transfer across great distances. Through Pompeii, you could deposit funds in one city and have a correspondent payout in another. Cicero, a century earlier, had used exactly this to send his son an allowance in Athens without shipping a single coin across the sea. By our period, this was a standard practice, and it mattered enormously. Moving physical silver was slow, heavy, and pirate baits, even in the pacified Mediterranean. And crucially, Roman bankers kept books, and the law took those books seriously. The core instrument of Roman accounting was the codex accepti et expensi, the ledger of receipts and payments, fed through a rough daybook called the advensaria, where transactions were jotted as they happened before being formally entered each month. These were single entry, not double entry accounting records, because that invention is more than a millennium away. But a systematic, dated, and legally potent system was being developed by the Romans. Bankers were held to a higher documentary standard than ordinary businessmen. Under the obligation of edatio rationum, an argentarius could be compelled to produce his account books as evidence in court, even in a dispute he wasn't party to. Think about what that means. Roman law treated a banker's ledger as a quasi-public record. The entries themselves could create binding obligations. This is a legal accounting infrastructure, and it's a part of why credit could scale. There's a modern rhyme here too. We still hold banks to stricter bookkeeping and disclosure standards than ordinary businesses. Audited statements, regulatory filings, the whole post-Enron, post-2008 apparatus, and for the same underlying reason the Romans did. When your business is other people's money, your ledger is a public utility. The question begs, what did credit cost? The customary legal ceiling on interest was 12% per year, the centesima usura 1% per month. In practice, safe lending and stable times ran cheaper. We hear of typical rates in the range of 4 to 6% in the early 2nd century, which tells you something about how much liquidity and confidence the Pax Romana had generated. But there's one glorious exception to the interest rate cap, the Finis Nectium, the maritime loan. Lend money to finance a sea voyage, and you could charge whatever the market would bear, because legally, the lender bore the risk. If the ship sank, the debt died with it. If that sounds familiar, it should, because it's insurance and venture financing rolled into one instrument. The interest rate premium over the 12% cap was Functionally, an insurance premium priced to a shipwreck risk. Today, we've unbundled that single contract into maritime insurance, venture capital, and catastrophe bonds. But the core logic, charging more for the chance of total loss, hasn't moved an inch. One more thing about who was in the system. It wasn't just senators. Senators, in fact, were technically barred by old custom from grubby commerce. So they operated through intermediaries, which were the freedmen, agents, and slaves. Roman law developed a whole toolkit for this. A slave or freedman can run a business, a shop, or even a bank using a fund called the peculium, with the master's liability cap the liability of the investor at the amount invested. That, folks, is the conceptual seed of limited liability. The Sapucci family themselves were probably descendants of freedmen, which were the ex-slaves whose family firms ended up financing the grain trade that fed Rome. Social mobility, again, running through the counting house. Vespasian's younger son, Domitian, took over in 81 CE and ruled for 15 years, and was one of the most rigorous monetary administrators Rome ever had. Now, as a reminder, Nero, back in 64 CE, had debased the denarius, cut its weight, and dropped its purity to roughly 90% silver. Every emperor since had quietly kept the cheaper standard. Domitian did something almost unheard of in monetary history. In 82 CE, he reversed the debasement. He restored the denarius to the old Augustan standard, roughly 98% fine silver, voluntarily giving up seigniorage, which is the profit a state makes from minting cheaper coins, because he believed that the coinage was the empire's credibility struck in metal. He tightened mint administration and quality control to match. Numismatists can literally see the improvements in the coins from his reign. The modern analog is the central banker who accepts real, immediate pain to restore the trust in the money. Think of Paul Volcker driving the interest rates towards nearly 20% in 1980 to strangle inflation, which sacrificed growth and his own popularity to rebuild the dollar's credibility. Hard money discipline is always expensive now and valuable later, which is exactly why in Rome, as in Washington, it's so rare. It didn't fully last though. War on the Danube frontier got expensive, and in 85 CE, he had to bring the purity back down. But note this, he brought it down to about 93%, still above Nero's standard, and he held it there for the rest of his reign. In an era when the easy move was always to shave the coinage, Domitian shaved his budget instead. The question is where did the pressure come from? It was partially from his own signature policy. In 84 CE, Domitian raised army pay by a full third, from 225 to 300 denarii per year, the first military raise since Augustus over a century earlier. It was wildly expensive and also arguably overdue. The entire year of the four emperors had demonstrated what happens when soldiers feel underpaid and are up for auctions. Domitian brought the army's loyalty transparently with salary, rather than letting it be bought corruptly with donations. The legions stayed loyal to him to the end. It was the Senate and the palace staff that got him. Economics has a name for what Domitian did: efficiency wages, paying above the market rate so the people you depend on have too much to lose by betraying you. Henry Ford ran the same playbook in 1914 when he doubled his workers' pay to $5 a day and watched turnover and sabotage evaporate. Domitian's raise was the $5 day for the legions. Domitian also gives us one of the earliest famous examples of a heavy-handed agricultural market intervention. After a grain shortage coincided with a wine glut, he issued an edict banning new vineyards in Italy and ordering half the vineyards in the provinces wiped out to push land back towards grain. It was largely never enforced. The howls from the wine-producing provinces were immediate, and Domitian, to his credit, backed off. But it's a preview of a recurring Roman temptation we'll meet again in a big way in a future episode. The belief that you can command an economy by decree. Spoiler from Diocletian's era, you can't. And if ripping out vineyards to fix the grain market sounds absurd, considering the fact that the modern world has paid farmers not to plant since the 1930s, that the European Union spent decades draining literal wine lakes and butter mountains, and that OPEC exists to do for oil exactly what Domitian tried to do for grapes. Supply management by decree is a temptation no government has ever fully outgrown. There's also a dark side to Domitian. As Domitian's building programs, games, and wars drained the treasury, he turned to confiscations, condemning wealthy senators on flimsy treason charges and seizing their assets. And he enforced the Fiscus Judaicus, the Jewish tax his father had created, with notorious aggressiveness. Suetonius says he personally witnessed, as a young man, a 90-year-old man being physically examined in a crowded courtroom to determine whether he was liable for a tax. When the taxation turns into perdition, you've crossed from public finance into state violence, and Rome noticed. In September 96 CE, Domitian was stabbed to death in a palace conspiracy. The Senate, which loathed him, passed Dammatio Memorae. His name was chiseled off monuments across the empire, and his statues were melted down. The Flavian dynasty was over, but the empire Domitian left behind had sound coinage, a well-paid army, and full granaries, and it was about to enjoy the best run of leadership in its history. Despite its hiccups with Caligula and Nero, Rome was now coming off two very successful centuries of expansion, and the period from 96 to 180, the reigns of the so-called five good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, represents Rome at its administrative and economic peak. What made it work, ironically, was the absence of a dynasty. For 4 successions in a row, each emperor, lacking a natural son, adopted the most capable man available as his heir. Merit-based succession by accident of biology. It produced the longest run of competent government Rome ever saw. Now, Nerva reigned for only 16 months from 96 to 98 CE because he was an elderly senator installed after Domitian's murder. But look at what he squeezed into that time. He reformed the abusive administration of the Fiscus Judaicus and advertised that on the money striking coins, which read into translation, the malicious prosecution of the Jewish tax has been abolished. Think about that as a communication strategy. The using of the coinage, the one piece of government media that passed through literally everyone's hands to announce a taxpayer rights reform. It's the ancient ancestor of a central bank forward guidance and the IRS taxpayer Bill of Rights rolled into one. Policy change delivered as public messaging stamped onto the medium of exchange itself. He launched agrarian purchases to settle the poor on land. With the Praetorians turning mutinous, Nerva adopted the empire's most respected general, Trajan, as his son and heir. He died shortly after, having been emperor barely long enough to warm the seats, and handed off the smoothest succession imaginable. Trajan, ruling from 98 to 117 CE, was the first emperor born outside of Italy from Italia, Spain, and under him, the empire hit its maximum territorial extent. And I want to talk about the wars the way a CFO would, because Trajan's conquest of Dacia, modern Romania, and the brutal wars ending in 106 CE was, among other things, the single greatest financial windfall in Roman imperial history. Dacia had gold mines. Dacia had a royal treasury hoard, which its king had famously hidden by diverting a river, burying the treasure in the riverbed, and re-diverting the riverbank back, a secret betrayed to the Romans by a captured courtier. The figures reported in ancient sources, as transmitted through later historians, are basically absurd, on the order of 165 tons of gold and over 300 tons of silver that was hauled back to Rome, plus the ongoing production of the Dacian mines that was worked by the imperial administration, which was feeding into the mints for decades. Even if you discount those numbers heavily, and you probably should, the effects on the Roman economy was unmistakable. Trajan tax cuts, distribution of enormous cash gifts to the citizens. He threw 128 days of games with thousands of gladiators and still had money left over for the greatest building program Rome had ever seen. Economists have a name for what usually happens to states that strike it rich this way: the resource curse. A one-time windfall floods in, gets spent on consumption, monuments, and handouts, distorts every price it touches, and leaves nothing productive behind when the flow stops. The boom and bust arc of the petrostate riding through the price of crude. The modern exception is Norway, which pipes all its oil reserves into a sovereign wealth fund and spends only the investment returns. Rome handed the same choice in 106 CE, went the other way, as most economies do. It threw a party. 123 days of games is a lot of fun, and 0% yield. This is Rome's business model at peak performance. So let me say it plainly. Rome's economy was structurally predatory. New conquests brought slaves, tributes, and one-time plunder that subsidized everything: the legions, the grain dole, the marble. Conquest was a revenue engine, and like any business built on one-time windfalls, rather than productive recurring revenue, it only works while you keep finding new windfalls. So file that away. It's the whole second half of the episode. But before we get cynical, let's give Trajan credit for the generally productive things he built with the Dacian gold. The alimenta. This is one of the most fascinating financial mechanisms of antiquity, conceived under Nerva, implemented at scale by Trajan. The empire made permanent loans to Italian landowners, typically around 8% of their land's assessed value, secured by mortgages on the land itself, and roughly 5% interest, about half the going commercial rate. Cheap capital for agriculture. And the interest payments didn't go back to the treasury, they were paid to the local town and earmarked to support local children, monthly subsistence payments for boys and girls, with the goal of boosting the free-born Italian population that supplied the legions. Now look at the architecture of that. A public investment fund, secure lending, subsidized interest rates, and dedicated social welfare payment stream, administered by town, with details engraved on bronze tablets, two of which survive to this day, which allowed us to reconstruct the whole scheme. It's essentially a development bank crossed with a child benefit program in the 2nd century. If you squint hard enough, you can see half the modern policy toolkit inside it. Subsidized lending to a priority sector, like government-backed mortgage credits, an endowment structure where the principal stays deployed and only income funds the program, like university endowments or Norway's fiscal rule for its oil fund, and a per-child cash benefit, which most developed countries now run in some form. Trajan's clerks would understand a child tax credit in about 5 minutes. Trajan built the great hexagonal harbor at Portus, which would have finally given Rome's grain supply a proper deep-water port. He also built the Markets of Trajan, a multi-story complex of well over 100 vaulted commercial spaces, offices, and shops that historians love to call the world's first shopping mall. And here's the detail for the accountants listening. Trajan's Forum complex also housed offices of the imperial administration and public archives. It was the empire's paperwork that had gotten a marble filing cabinet. Now, he had built new roads that ultimately helped trade, but there's an interesting caveat here because one school of historians insists that no Roman road was ever built to promote trade, that the roads were actually built for a rapid movement of legions and imperial couriers, that Rome knew only military and political exposures, not economic investment in the modern sense. And the reason being is no Roman emperor ever really stood up and announced a stimulus package per se. But intent is an outcome. 50+ thousand miles of paved roads, harbors, lighthouses, and bridges, plus a navy that helped sweep away the Mediterranean clean of pirates, created the largest integrated market the Western world would ever see until the early modern times. Standardized coinage accepted from Britain to Syria, custom duties at predictable rates, typically 2 to 5% of the provincial boundaries. One system enforcing contracts across 3 continents. Whatever the emperors intended, what they built was a trade zone. Merchants certainly noticed, even if the Senate didn't. Trajan also did something subtle with coinage that deserves mention. Around 107 CE, flush with Dacian metal, he recalled and melted down the old denarii from the days of Nero that were still in circulation, effectively retiring a century of tired money and reminting it. Governments still do this. India demonetized 86% of its cash overnight in 2016, and central banks routinely retire old note series, though rarely with Trajan's luxury of mountains of fresh Dacian silver to smooth the swap. It's housekeeping. But monetary housekeeping is exactly what you can afford to do when the treasury is overflowing, and it kept the circulating currency credible even though Trajan's own denarii has settled to around 89% silver, quietly a notch below Domitian's standard. Remember that ratchet? Every debasement was easier to repeat than reverse. Nero had set the precedent, and the precedent, not the percentage, was the poison. Economists call this moral hazard. The lesson of rescue teaches that makes the next crisis more likely. Nero's debasement was ancient Rome's too big to fail moments, proof that the emergency exit worked, which guaranteed that everyone after him would use it. Now I want to switch gears slightly here, so let's talk about the trade routes, because this is where Pax Romana economy gets truly global and where the drain begins. Now I want you to picture the flow of goods into Rome around 100 CE. Silk came in from Han China, passed hand to hand across Central Asia. Pepper and spices from India's Malabar coast. Pearls from the Persian Gulf. Ivory from Africa and India. Frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia. Fine glass and textiles moving in from every direction. In the city of Rome, pepper was distributed to small retail shops in the spice district along the Via Sacra, sold in little packets to wealthy and middle-class families alike. While the truly precious goods such as the pearls, ivory, fine hardwood furniture, Chinese silk, were all sold inside the forum itself. Domitian, that meticulous administrator, had even built a dedicated pepper warehouse in the heart of Rome, right along the Sacred Way. The Roman state built central city warehousing for a single imported commodity. That's how big this trade was. And what pepper was to the Roman kitchen, the pepper trade was to the Roman fortune hunter. What investment banking is to the ambitious today, the Eastern trade was to the Romans, the most direct route to great riches. The greedy man in the empire was proverbially the first to take the fresh bought pepper from the camel's back. So how did this physically work? And here's the genius part. Sometime in the 1st century BCE, Greek and Roman sailors mastered what Indian and Arab sailors had long known, the monsoon. A navigator's handbook from our period, which was written by an anonymous Greek-speaking merchant around the 50s to 70 CE, lays out the whole system like a Lonely Planet guide for traders. Which ports to use, which goods to trade, which kings to bribe. Ships left Egypt's Red Coast ports in July, rode the southwest monsoon straight across the open ocean into India in about 6 weeks, spent the autumn trading in ports like Marcus Aurelius on the Malabar coast, then caught the reversed northeast monsoon home in the winter. Strabo tells us that already in Augustus' day, 120 ships a year were making the Indian run from one port alone. Round trip, under a year. Direct, no middlemen. This was a genuine ocean-going trade network, 15 centuries before Vasco da Gama supposedly opened the route. In the 1980s, the famous Myoseros papyrus, dating from the mid-2nd century CE, squarely in this period, containing part of a loan contract for exactly this trade. One side records the financing agreement for the voyage. The other side inventories the cargo from a ship called the Hermopolitan, home from Myoseros. Within it, there was ivory and bales of textiles, and above all, pepper in bulk. The assessed value of that single cargo after the state took its cut, nearly 7 million sesterces. Now, to put that into perspective, the minimum property qualifications for the Roman senator was 1 million sesterces. One shipload was worth more than 7 million senatorial fortunes. The contract shows the lender advancing funds in Alexandria, the cargo itself pledged as security, agents and warehouses at both ends. The goods were hauled by camel from the Red Sea coast to the Nile, barged down to Alexandria, then held in a bonded warehouse under the lender's control until the loan cleared. Trade finance, collateral management, documentary security, all of it functioning in the 140 CE. And notice who else was at the table: the Roman state. Eastern imports coming through the Red Sea were hit with a 25% custom duty. A quarter of the value of one of the richest trade flows on earth skimmed straight into the imperial coffers. Some historians have argued, only half-jokingly, that India trade may have been one of the largest single revenue lines in the imperial budget. So when moralists complained about silk and pepper, the treasury quietly cashed the customs receipts. Before income taxes existed, custom duties were the fiscal backbone of most states. Tariffs funded the majority of the United States federal government for most of the 19th century. And governments have always managed the same hypocrisy the Romans did, denouncing luxury imports from the podium while budgeting around the duty revenue in the back office. The Arabian branch of this trade was its own world. Frankincense from southern Arabia, or Arabia Felix, also known as Happy Arabia, because incense made it rich, traveled by camel caravan up the peninsula. Pliny the Elder walks us through the cost structure like an auditor. The priest at Shabwa took 10% of the cargo as the tithe at the source, and then incense passed to the Tamna, the capital of Kabunete, who controlled the outward routes. The 1,500-mile journey from Damna to Gaza took 65 days, and fees, tolls, fodder, water, and lodging piled up at every stage. Pliny reckons that about 688 denarii per camel before Roman import duties, roughly 1,000 denarii per load all in. A camel carried about 500 pounds. In Rome, the best frankincense, judged by the whiteness, brittleness, and how cleanly it burned, sold for about 6 denarii per pound. The lowest grade, 3 per pound, about the price of black pepper. Run the numbers, and a camel load could clear on the order of 1,500 denarii in profit, distributed all along the chain of middlemen. And for scale, a denarius, a small silver coin of about 1/8 of an ounce, was roughly a day's wages for a skilled laborer. A pound of frankincense was a week's wages. A pound of myrrh, 2 weeks. Balsam from Palestine could reach 1,000 denarii a pound. Rome burned perhaps 10,000 camel loads of incense a year, something like 15 million denarii annually, quite literally going up in smoke. Although, for perspective on Roman wealth inequality, Seneca's personal fortune alone was reputed at nearly 100 million denarii. The most visible remnant of the caravan wealth today is Petra, the rose-red rock-cut capital of the Nabateans in southern Jordan, a city of tomb temples covered by tolls. Trajan, incidentally, annexed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 CE, the same year Dacia fell, bringing the incense toll booth in-house. And the economics of the incense trade route followed a pattern you'll recognize from modern illicit trades. Think of the drug trade. Cheap and safe near the agricultural source, riskier and wildly more profitable the closer you got to the end consumer. Value accrued to whoever controlled the choke points. Some things never change. And here's a preview of a much later episode. Centuries down the road, the wealth and networks of this same Arabian caravan trade route would form the commercial world that gave birth to Islam, a faith carried outward along these exact land and sea routes until it dominated the commercial and spiritual life of Asia. Trade routes have consequences far beyond invoice. Now, the big question, the one Roman moralists asked then and historians still argue about now: was the eastern trade route bleeding Rome dry? Pliny the Elder famously quipped that India, China, and Arabia together drained 100 million sesterces from the empire every year. So much do our luxuries and our women cost us. And the physical evidence seems to back him up. Hordes of Roman gold and silver coins kept turning up in southern India. The great historian in the Indo-Roman trade, E.H. Warmington, put the bare case in one sentence. The empire, taken as a unit, was often unable to offer foreign nations sufficient produce of its own to balance its imports. And the result was a drain of precious metal and coined money without adequate return. Italy consumed more than it produced. Rome was a city, and Latium was a district, poor in manufacturers. This will not be a one-off instance with Rome. We will see the same exact situation with the conquistadors of Spain. When they conquered much of the Western Hemisphere, they were extracting silver from particular places in South America and in Mexico. And it was basically bypassing Spain altogether and heading east into Asia, into China in particular, because the Spanish were importing silks and other fine goods, such as ceramics. So this isn't just a Roman story. This is kind of a European story. But the conventional wisdom that Rome simply went broke buying pepper and silk deserves a pushback. And modern scholarship has pushback. Consider 3 points. First, Rome was not metal poor. Its advanced civil engineering gave it enormous advantages in mining, and Spanish silver, Dacian gold, and a dozen other districts kept replenishing the stock. Second, Rome exported far more than the moralists wanted to admit. To India went red Mediterranean coral, which was prized on the subcontinent. And the world's finest glass was also beloved in China. Spanish lead and copper filled the ship's ballast holds. Cornish tin moved through Alexandria for onward shipments. And Italian vessels bound for Egypt and India groaned with cargoes of wine. Third, and this is a clever bit, there was arbitrage. China and India valued silver more highly relative to gold than the Mediterraneans did. The exchange rate disparity had existed since at least Seneca's day. So Roman merchants quite rationally paid in silver. It would have been madness to pay in anything else, and gold actually flowed westward out of India in impressive quantities. Rome wasn't just hemorrhaging money eastward, it was, at least in part, running a metals trade on favorable terms. Now take a step back and listen to this whole debate with modern ears, because you've heard it all before on cable news. A wealthy consumer society runs a persistent trade deficit with the East. Moralists thunder that the nation is being drained to pay for imported luxuries. Hard money flows out year after year. And skeptics answer that the headline deficit ignores the exports, services, and financial flows moving in the other way. Swap silver for dollars and Rome for the United States, and Pliny the Elder is a talking head complaining about the China trade deficit. Even the arbitrage has a modern twin. Roman merchants exploiting the east-west gap in the gold-to-silver ratio were doing what currency traders do to this day when they run carry trades across interest rate differentials. The instruments change. The game doesn't. So the honest verdict is, the drain was real, but it was survivable. A luxury tax the empire could afford while the mines produced and the borders expanded. The Eastern trade didn't kill Rome, but it did mean the empire's monetary system had a permanent slow leak. And the slow leak only matters when you stop refilling the tank. Keep that image, because we're getting there. Trajan died in 117 CE, and his adopted successor, Hadrian, made the single most consequential economic decision of the 2nd century, disguised as a military one. He stopped expanding. Hadrian abandoned Trajan's freshly conquered, unprofitable territories in Mesopotamia. He pulled the frontiers back to the defensible lines and spent his reign consolidating rather than conquering. The most famous symbol is the wall he built across northern Britain, the 73 miles of stone and turf studded with forts and gates. And Hadrian's wall was never just a military barrier. It defended against raiders from the north, yes, but its regularly spaced gates also let Rome control civilian movements and channel cross-border traffic through custom points where tolls could be levied. It's a border control system and revenue installation as much as it is a fortification. A toll booth that's 80 miles long. Now, statistically, consolidation was probably wise. Economically, it flipped a switch nobody could see. Remember the business model. Conquest brings plunder, slaves, indemnities, and new tax-paying provinces. Once the frontier stabilized, roughly from Hadrian onward, that revenue engine stalled. No new territory meant no new plunder, no new mass enslavements, no new revenue streams from the newly annexed peoples, and that inflow had been a cornerstone of Roman political and economic policy since the days of the Republic. The empire's costs, the army, the bureaucracy, the games, the dole, kept right on growing. The windfalls stopped. Hadrian, to his credit, governed the transition brilliantly. And his first major fiscal act is one of my favorite scenes in Roman financial history. In 118 CE, facing an empire full of taxpayers hopelessly behind on their obligation, Hadrian canceled 900 million sesterces in unpaid tax arrears, roughly 15 years of accumulated back taxes owed to the treasury and the fiscus. And to make sure everyone believed it, he had the tax records, the actual debt paperwork, hauled into the Forum of Trajan and publicly burned. We're not guessing about this. The commemorative inscription survives, boasting that, by this act, he made secure not just his contemporaries, but their descendants as well. And coins were struck, showing the emperor putting a torch to the pile. Think about the fiscal logic. Those receivables were largely uncollectible anyway. Writing them off cleared the books, freed indebted taxpayers to participate in the economy again, and brought immense goodwill, all for the price of paper losses. It's a sovereign bad debt write-down staged as public theater. Modern central bankers dream of a messaging this clean. And the underlying policy question is still alive. When the IMF and the World Bank wrote off the debts of heavily indebted poor countries in the 2000s, when Greece's private collectors took a haircut of more than half in 2012, when Americans argue over student loan forgiveness, that's Hadrian's bonfire every time. The recognition that a debt which cannot be collected is a fiction on the books and a millstone on the debtor, and that clearing it can be worth more than pretending it will never be paid back. The counterargument is just as ancient, that forgiveness teaches borrowers to expect the next bonfire. Rome ran that experiment too, and we'll see that. Marcus Aurelius would light the next fire 60 years later. Beyond the bonfire, Hadrian's reforms were the quiet, structural kind that accountants appreciate. He continued shifting tax collection away from the old publicani, which were the private tax farming syndicates whose profit motive had made the word tax collector a synonym for an extortionist. He then shifted it towards direct collection by salaried imperial officials and local city governments. From tax farming to a revenue service, one of the most important administrative arcs in ancient fiscal history. Now, for the record, the modern world reran this experiment. When the United States handed delinquent tax accounts to private collection agencies in the 1990s, and again after 2004 and 2017, the programs repeatedly cost nearly as much as they collected and generated a stream of abuse complaints for exactly the reason Rome abandoned the publicani. When the collector's paycheck is a percentage of what he extracts, the incentive is extraction. He also professionalized the bureaucracy, staffing the great financial secretariats with career equestrian administrators rather than imperial freedmen, building an actual civil service with defined career ladders. He commissioned the jurist Salvius Julianus to codify the praetor's edict, the accumulation body of Roman commercial and civil remedies, into a fixed, permanent text. Legal predictability is invisible economic infrastructure. Every merchant, lender, and shipper in the empire now knew the rules wouldn't shift under their feet. On the great imperial estates of North Africa, the Lex Hadriana granted sharecropping tenants the right to claim and cultivate unused marginal land, with years of rent-free tenure and heritable near ownership rights over what they brought under the plow. Land reform designed to convert idle acreage into taxable production. Supply-side policy, 2nd century style. Hadrian spent over half his reign traveling to the provinces, inspecting, auditing, correcting, and building as he went, including the rebuilding the Pantheon in Rome with its magnificent concrete dome, which is still standing, and still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. He was also a man of intense personal passions. His beloved companion Antoninus drowned mysteriously in the Nile in 130 CE, and Hadrian, who was shattered, founded an entire city in his memory and had him deified. Statues of Antonius were mass-produced across the empire, which tells you something about both grief and the imperial image industry. But here's the Hadrian paradox to carry forward. Everything he did made the empire run better, while the deep engine conquest was switched off for good. Rome after Hadrian was a magnificently administered machine that had quietly lost its primary income source and yet not noticed, because a century of accumulated wealth, full mines, and peak trade masked the problem. The empire, viewed with modern eyes, still poured staggering sums into economically unproductive prestige. These were the monuments, temples, and games. Even the roads, aqueducts, and ports were built primarily for military and political ends, not as deliberate economic investments. Nobody was investing in productivity. Nobody was asking where the next dacia was coming from, because there wasn't one. Hadrian died in 138 and was succeeded by his adopted son Antoninus Pius, who reigned 23 years, one of the longest reigns in Roman history, and is famous above all for the fact that almost nothing happened. There were no major wars, no crises. The emperor never left Italy. Historians have joked that his reign is one of the most poorly documented golden ages imaginable, precisely because peace generates no headlines. For a podcast about money, Antonius Pius is secretly one of the stars of the whole imperial story because of a single number. When he died in 161 CE, he left a treasury of surplus of 2.7 billion sesterces, or 675 million denarii, the largest cash reserve any emperor ever bequeathed. And he did it without conquest, without confiscations, and without raising taxes. The question is how? It was because he had a ruthless, unglamorous cost discipline. He slashed the expenses of the imperial court, traveled little, pointing out that an emperor's traveling entourage was a locust swarm that ate the provinces bare. He managed the imperial estates like a careful private landlord he had been before taking office, and vetted every single expenditure. When his wife Faustina reproached him for his stinginess after he cut the household budget, he reportedly replied that now that he had taken over the empire, he'd lost even what he had before, meaning he considered his private fortune absorbed into public service. He personally lent money at 4%, undercutting the market rates as a deliberate act of liquidity provision, and when famine and disaster struck, he provided relief from his own funds. He also left his mark on commercial law and what we'd call human capital. His jurists advanced protections for slaves. An emperor could now intervene against the master's cruelty. He extended the rules on freedmen's rights and refined the law of sale, guardianship, and inheritance in ways that made everyday commerce more predictable. There's a Roman saying that fits him perfectly. Happy the empire whose emperor is boring. Central bankers say the same thing about their own profession. When monetary policy gets exciting, something has gone badly wrong. And that great surplus is the ancient version of a sovereign wealth fund, a state deliberately banking its good years against its bad ones. The tragedy, as we're about to see, is that Rome's rainy day fund was about to meet a 20-year monsoon. Rome in 161 CE was the wealthiest, most stable, most creditworthy state on the planet, with the soundest coinage and functioning markets from Scotland to Syria. It was the top. And you know what happens after the top. Marcus Aurelius reigned from 161 to 180 CE, the last of the 5 good emperors. The philosopher on the throne, author of Meditations, which he wrote in Greek, in a military tent, on the freezing Danube frontier, never intending anyone to read it. And his reign is one of the great stress tests of everything we've talked about today. Every system, monetary, fiscal, banking, and trade got hit all at once. So watch now how he manages it. And to start with an innovation, Marcus began his reign by doing something no emperor had done before. He insisted on sharing his power fully with his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, as co-emperor. 2 Augusti, equal in law. And he advertised the arrangement the Roman way, on its coinage, striking issues showing the 2 emperors clasping hands with the legion Concordia, or concord, or harmony. Money as mass media again. Every hand that received the denarius received the message that the government was unified and stable. Modern states do the same thing through different media. The joint press conferences, the coordinated central bank statements, and the carefully staged handshake, because the asset being managed is identical, which is confidence. Markets, whether they're ancient or modern, price political stability before they price anything else. He needed this stability because the bills came due immediately. Parthia attacked in the east. Varus led the counteroffensive, and Rome won. But in 165 CE, the returning legions brought back something worse than any Parthian army, a pathogen picked up during the sack of Seleucia in Mesopotamia. We call it the Antonine Plague, which was probably smallpox, based on the symptoms described by the great physician Galen, who witnessed it firsthand and, being no fool, initially got out of Rome. Now, sources to this matter kind of get mangled a little bit about what happened. The plague that killed 5,000 people a day in Rome was different from the later epidemic, the plague of Cyprian, in the mid-3rd century, a story for a future episode. For the Antonine Plague, Cassius Dio reports 2,000 deaths a day in Rome at the height of the recurrence, which is horrifying enough. Modern estimates put the total mortality somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the empire, possibly 10% of the entire population, with much higher rates in the packed cities and, critically, in the army camps where men lived shoulder to shoulder. So let's run the economic consequences with me, because a plague is a financial event. The labor supply collapsed. Fewer farmers meant less grain and less rent from imperial estates. Fewer artisans meant fewer goods. Entire districts of Egypt, the empire's breadbasket and best documented tax region, shows villages emptying and tax rolls shrinking in the papyri from these exact years. Tax revenue fell just as military spending exploded, because the plague years coincided with something new and terrifying. Germanic peoples were breaking across the Danube, at one point penetrating into northern Italy itself. The Macronamic Wars would consume the rest of Marcus's life. The army had to be rebuilt while it was dying. Marcus resorted to enrolling slaves, gladiators, and bandits into the legions, and paying for it all. If you lived through the early 2020s, this sequence should raise the hair on your neck, because you watch a version of it. A pandemic shocks the labor supply, output falls, government spending surges to hold society together, and a few years later, inflation arrives as too much money chases too few goods and too few workers. The Antonine Plague is the ancient world's COVID moment, and with many times the mortality and none of the medicine. And its economic aftermath ran the same script. Labor scarce, wages and prices under pressure, and the state minting money against shrinking production. Historians draw the same line to the Black Death, which emptied Europe's labor market so thoroughly that surviving workers' wages soared for a generation. Plagues are, among all their horrors, violent repricings of human labor. So, revenue falling, costs exploding, workforce shrinking. What does the philosopher do? And here's the report card, and honestly, it's remarkable. So for one, he sold the palace before taxing the people. Facing treasury shortages at the outbreak of the Northern Wars, Antonius's great surplus having been consumed by war and plague, Marcus refused to impose extraordinary new taxes on the suffering population. Instead, he held a public auction in the form of Trajan of imperial property. Gold and crystal tableware, silk, and gold-embroidered garments from the imperial wardrobe, even, the sources say, some of his wife's jewels. The sale reportedly ran for 2 months. The emperor liquidated his own balance sheet before touching yours. Later, after victories improved the situation, he even offered to buy items back from the purchasers who wished to return them, and pointedly forced no one to do so. Governments in fiscal distress still reach for this move. Greece privatized ports and airports under its bailout program. Cash-strapped cities sell their own buildings and lease them back, and leaders still understand its symbolic power, which is why chief executives take $1 salaries in a crisis. Selling the emperor's dinnerware raised real money, but its greater value was the message: sacrifice starts at the top. The second thing he did was he burned the debts again. In 178 CE, following Hadrian's precedent, Marcus canceled all the debts owed to the imperial fiscus and the public treasury accumulated over the previous 46 years, and burned the records in the forum. Half a century of receivables written off in an afternoon bonfire to reset an economy staggering under plague and war. He also granted relief to struggling cities across the empire and repeatedly funded disaster recovery, which were the earthquakes, floods, and famine, from imperial funds. The third thing he did was he debased the coinage carefully, and he told on himself in the metal. With costs impossible to cover, Marcus did reach for the mint. The silver purity of the denarius, roughly 89% when he took office, was brought down in steps to about 74 to 76% by his death. That's real debasement. the biggest slide since Nero, and it continued the dangerous precedent that every single fiscal emergency could be solved by shaving the silver. But note two things here. First, the arrears, the gold coin, was left essentially untouched in weight and purity. Partially that's practical. Silver debasement is easy to disguise with surface treatments and alloying, while gold's weight and color betray tampering immediately. Partially it's that gold served as the store of value layer, the coin of large transactions, army donatives, and hoarding. And anyone who can get access to gold hoarded it rather than spend it. And frankly, it's a fair bet that Marcus, or nearly any ruler in history, would have debased the gold too if it could be done without being noticed at once. Second, compare the responses to the shock. Rome lost perhaps a tenth of its population and fought a decade of wars. And the currency lost about 15 points in fineness. It's damage, but it's manageable damage. The catastrophe came later, when lesser men treated the emergency tool as a routine one. Within 70 years of Marcus's death, the silver coinage would be about 5% silver, which was a washed on film over bronze. The modern vocabulary for this is money printing. And the modern debate is the same debate. Expanding money supply in a genuine emergency, such as 2008 and 2020, can honestly be the least bad option, exactly as it was arguably for Marcus. The danger is never the first emergency, it's the normalization, when the extraordinary tool becomes the ordinary budget. Rome's 3rd century is what the end of the road looks like. And the fourth part, and the part that's almost no one talks about, is he reformed the plumbing of private finance. Marcus was a lawyer emperor to his bones. Sources say he was generous in granting legal remedies, and his reign is dense with finance legal reform. He strengthened and systematized the Roman trust, the fidesimacon, the device by which you could leave property to a trustee with binding instructions to hold, manage, or pass it on to beneficiaries, including people who couldn't formally inherit under the strict old law. Under Marcus, the enforcement machinery matured. Dedicated praetors handled trust disputes, and the fideicomissum became a reliable instrument for managing and distributing family legacies across generations. Functionally, these are the ancestors of trust companies and estate planning, which was wealth management, 2nd century edition. Through the Senate Consultum Officinum in 178 CE, he gave children first claim to inherit from their mothers, a landmark that recognized property flowing through the maternal line, complementing an earlier measure under which mothers could inherit from their children. Inheritance law is capital allocation law. These reforms changed how family wealth moved through Roman society, and notably improved the property position of women and their heirs. He created something genuinely new in government, a public registry of births, requiring citizens to register children within 30 days. Civil records infrastructure, the boring bedrock on which claims of citizenship, inheritance, and status could be proven. He appointed a dedicated praetor for guardianship cases, tightening protection of minors' estates and Roman guardianship law, because remember, this was fundamentally an asset management law. Guardians had to manage the ward's property prudently and could be sued for mismanagement. Fiduciary duty with teeth. He also policed the money itself. Jurists of the era treat coinage crimes, counterfeiting, coin clipping, refusing genuine imperial coin with increasing severity, because when the state is quietly lowering silver content, public confidence in the face value of the coin becomes the entire ballgame. The fifth thing Marcus did was he went global. In 166 CE, Chinese court records, the annals of the later Han Dynasty, report the arrival at the Han court of an embassy from Andong, king of Dacian, coming by sea via the emperor's southern frontier in what is now Vietnam, bearing gifts of ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoise shells. Andong is almost certainly Antonius, Marcus Aurelius' Antonius. Dacian was the Chinese name for Rome. The Chinese imagined Dacian as a kind of mirror China at the far end of the world, which meant it was vast, wealthy, and honest in trade. Now, were these actual imperial diplomats? Probably not. Most historians suspect they were enterprising Roman or Greco-Egyptian merchants promoting themselves to the Han courts, especially since their gifts were suspiciously Southeast Asian in character. Likely they were picked up en route. But either way, it's the first recorded direct contact between the Roman and Chinese worlds. For centuries, goods had flowed between them directly. Chinese silk and Indian ceramics had been drifting into Italy since the Etruscan days. They were passed through so many layers of middlemen along the way that no one at either end had ever met anyone from the other. Each handoff added markup and stripped information. The 166 CE embassy is the moment somebody finally tried to cut out the middlemen. Disintermediation by monsoon. Marcus spent his final years on the Danube, grinding out the Marcomannic Wars, writing the Meditations by lamplight. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. One of the war's strangest episodes became legend. In 174 CE, a Roman force trapped and dying of thirst in the Chaldee territory was saved when a sudden thunderstorm broke over the battlefield. Rain for the Romans, lightning against the enemy, if you believe the accounts. The rain miracle was immortalized on the Aurelian column in Rome, and for decades afterward, pagans and Christians argued over whose prayers had brought the storm. Even the weather in Rome became political messaging. Marcus Aurelius died on March 17th, 180 CE, near Vindobona, modern Vienna, probably of the plague that had shadowed his whole reign. And with his death, tradition closes the book on the Pax Romana, the 200-year golden age that opened with Augustus in 27 BCE, an era of hegemonic power, regional expansion, prosperous stability, and always relative, peace and order. It was never as tranquil as the name suggests. Revolts in Judea and Britain, wars in Parthia, and finally the Danube ablaze. But by any historical standard, it was extraordinary. And to circle back, he made one great mistake. The first of the 5 good emperors with a surviving natural son, and the last because he broke the streak of adoption and left the empire to that son. An 18-year-old Commodus who would be proven vain, erratic, and catastrophically uninterested in governing. The historian Cassius Dio, who lived through the transition, wrote the epitaph for the whole era. With the death of Marcus, Rome's history descended from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. So let's zoom out and do what we do on this show. Follow the money through the whole arc, because the seeds of the 3rd century collapse were planted during the golden age we just toured. The first seed was the plunder engine ran out of road. Rome's prosperity was built on a conquest model: tributes, indemnities, slaves, and one-time windfalls like Judea's temple treasure and Dacia's river of gold. And here's a useful contrast. The Greek world had used money to expand a productive, market-based commercial economy. Rome's growth ran on tributes rather than productivity. The city of Rome itself produced remarkably little. It was a consumption capital, though the Italian peninsula did export genuine surpluses of wine and olive oil. Once Hadrian fixed the frontiers, the windfalls stopped, but the cost base, the army, the swelling bureaucracy, the dole, the games, kept compounding. Government funds went to soldiers and clerks even as the legions brought back less and less plunder. Eventually, something had to give. The second seed was nobody invested. The Rome elites took the profits of the empire and put the money into luxury: silk from China, pepper and pearls from India, fine goods from Asia Minor and beyond, and into land speculation, the safe deposit box of the ancient world. The government put its surplus into prestige monuments, temples, and games. What almost no one did, not the state, not the senatorial class, was invested in raising productivity, in industry, in technology, and in getting more output per worker. In a weird parallel that would happen 1,000+ years later, when the conquistadors of Spain were conquering the Western Hemisphere and so much silver and gold was flowing into the empire, they kind of had a similar situation. The elites of Spain essentially became rent-seeking middlemen. They didn't really put those assets they had gotten from the New World into productivity or new technology. Instead, they did the same thing. They were buying luxury goods from the Far East. That's why the Spanish Empire should have lasted for a long time, died relatively quickly. So now getting back to the Roman Empire. Remember Vespasian turning down the hoeing machine to protect jobs? Multiply that instinct across an entire civilization for a century. The infrastructure that did get built, the roads, the ports, the aqueducts, was built for military and political ends and helped commerce only as a side effect. An economy that consumes its windfalls without reinvesting them is a trust fund heir, not a business. That's exactly what happened in Spain. The third seed, the slow leak. The Eastern luxury trade drained silver year after year to pay for goods that were burned as incense, warm as silk, and eaten as spice, consumed, not invested. While at least some of the gold flowed back west, the customs take softened the blow. Sustainable while the Spanish and Dacian mines poured out fresh metal, but mines deplete, and Rome's were beginning to. The fourth seed for the downfall was the debasement ratchet. Nero cut the denarius to 90% in a pinch, and the sky didn't fall. The currency stabilized. Inflation stayed modest. That was precisely the problem. It taught every later emperor that debasement was a free lunch. Domitian pushed purity back up, and history mostly forgot to thank him. Trajan eased it down. Marcus, under genuine existential pressure, took it down to 75%. Each individual decision was defensible. The trajectory was fatal. After 180 CE, emperors with worse problems and weaker scruples would ride that ratchet all the way down to worthless coins. The fifth seed in the downfall was that money outran the goods. For 2 centuries, Rome minted staggering volumes of coin. The mint of Juno Moneta, the temple whose name gives us the very words money and mint. It never stopped. And for most of that time, it did not ignite inflation because the empire itself was growing. More territory, more people, more trade meant proportionally more demand for coins. This mirrors what economists today call the quantity theory of money. Inflation takes off when money supply growth outpaces real economic outputs. During expansion, Rome's booming output absorbed the new coinage. Then, in the late 1st and 2nd centuries, the absorbing conditions faded. Expansion stopped. And after 165 CE, the plague actively shrank outputs, while war spending accelerated the minting. More coins, chasing fewer goods, moving faster, because velocity matters too. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civil servants receiving coin and spending it immediately amplifies inflationary pressures well beyond what the coin count alone could suggest. And prices don't change by decree. They change in a million small negotiations. Sellers, squeezed by their own rising costs, stopped discounting and haggled harder. Buyers, flush with debased coin, bid against each other for a shrinking pool of grain, cloth, and labor. Prices ratcheted upward from the bottom through exactly the decentralized market process Adam Smith would later call the invisible hand. Nobody legislated Rome inflation into existence. It emerged from thousands of individual, rational decisions made inside a system whose foundations had quietly shifted. And if the sequence, the supply shock, spending surge, swollen money supply, then stubborn inflation emerging from a million private decisions, sound less like ancient history and more like recent memory, well, that's rather the point of the show. Rome looked eternal, the largest, richest, best administered state on earth, with functional banks, enforceable contracts, ocean-going trade finance, and a currency accepted across 3 continents. But the engine was off, the leak was open, the ratchet was set, and the plague had done its damage. The next century would be one of the most catastrophic in monetary history. 50-year inflation, coins collapsing to a silver wash over bronze, and the return of credit transactions instead of currency transaction in some of the provinces. And we will cover every gory detail in the crisis of the 3rd century in a future episode. The takeaway to carry with you for this episode is, golden ages don't announce their endings. The Pax Romana's fatal flaws, extraction instead of production, consumption instead of investment, debasement instead of hard choices, were all present and all rewarded during its very best years. Prosperity is a terrible teacher. Remember that the next time someone tells you a boom is permanent. And this is being recorded in July of 2026. I would be interested to hear this again in July of 2028 or July of 2029, because we are currently going through an AI boom, and many suspect, and myself is included in this, is that we are in a bubble-like environment and it's gonna pop. Whether that popping of the AI bubble leads to a catastrophic recession or a correction, I don't know. But just remember that these booms don't last forever. They're never permanent. That's a wrap on this episode. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the best thing you can do is leave a 5-star review and pass it along to someone who would appreciate it. Word of mouth is everything for an independent show like this one. If you want to support the podcast directly and help keep it going, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/historyofmoneybankingtrade, or you can visit us at our website at moneybankingtrade.com. Until next time, I am Mike D, and this has been the history of money, banking, and trade.